German engineers destroyed every bridge on the Rhine, certain the river would stop the Allied advance for weeks. Then supplies began appearing on the far bank anyway. No bridges, no delay, and no explanation. On the western edge of Germany, in early March 1945, the Rhine River no longer looked like a boundary. It looked like a problem. For Allied planners, the Rhine was supposed to be crossed cleanly, by bridges captured intact, by armor moving in formation, by timetables drawn months in advance. Instead, what remained were broken spans, flooded banks, and currents strong enough to tear loose anything that tried to force its way across. German engineers had done what they were trained to do. They destroyed the bridges thoroughly. Stone, steel, and concrete collapsed into the river, leaving nothing usable behind. To them, this was not improvisation. It was doctrine. Across the river, Allied units gathered in growing numbers. Tanks waited. Trucks lined up, supplies accumulated faster than they could be moved. The river was not wide by ocean standards, but it might as well have been. Without bridges, nothing heavy crossed quickly. Without speed, momentum died. German observers watching the river saw familiar patterns. They expected pontoons. They expected engineering delays. They expected time, days, perhaps weeks, to work in their favor. And then something unfamiliar appeared along the muddy banks. It was not sleek, it was not armored. It did not resemble anything built for decisive combat. With its awkward hull, exposed wheels, and ungainly profile, it looked like a compromise that satisfied no one. German troops had a word for machines like this: improvised, unrefined, temporary. They laughed at it. The vehicle crept down the slope toward the water, its tires sinking into mud that would have trapped most trucks instantly. Instead of stopping, it kept moving. Instead of bogging down, it slid forward and then floated. No bridge sections were lowered. No elaborate assembly followed. The vehicle simply entered the river and continued on. From the far bank, German soldiers watched it cross without pause. This was not how crossings were supposed to happen. The German army had been built on precision. Vehicles were designed for specific roles, optimized for performance under ideal conditions. Engineering doctrine assumed preparation, order, and control. Rivers were obstacles to be reduced methodically, not bypassed casually. What they were seeing now did not fit the logic they trusted. The vehicle reached the opposite shore and climbed out of the water under its own power. Then another followed. Then another. Soon, there were dozens. Each carried something different: ammunition, fuel drums, rations, medical supplies. Not dramatic cargo, but essential cargo. What mattered was not what the vehicles carried. It was how little they seemed to care about terrain. Mud did not stop them. Water did not delay them. Destroyed bridges did not define their limits. The Rhine had been turned into a road. German defensive planning had assumed that destroying crossings would slow the enemy long enough for countermeasures to matter. That assumption was now unraveling in real time. No alarms were triggered. No single dramatic moment marked the failure. There was only a steady flow of supplies appearing where they were not supposed to be. Speed began replacing structure. The German system had been designed to deny access. What it could not deny was adaptability. The vehicle was not powerful. It was not impressive. But it was available everywhere, immediately, and without ceremony. And as more of them crossed the river, one uncomfortable realization set in. The Rhine was no longer buying time. It was simply being ignored. By the time German commanders understood what was happening, the problem was no longer the river itself. It was the pace on the far side of it. The crossing had already begun, and it was not waiting for perfection. Welcome to WW2 Forgotten Fronts, where the untold battles, hidden heroes, and overlooked machines of World War II finally come to light. Here, we uncover the stories history left behind, the frontline diaries, the lost operations, and the moments of courage that shaped the world, yet rarely appear in textbooks. If you enjoy deep storytelling, cinematic narration, and forgotten perspectives from the war, you're in the right place. Make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share this video. Your support helps this channel continue bringing these forgotten chapters of history back to life. Now, let's step into the past. The German army had not underestimated rivers. It had studied them obsessively. For decades, German military engineering doctrine treated major waterways as decisive barriers. Rivers slowed movement. They forced concentrations. They created predictable points of failure. Destroy the bridges, and the enemy would have to stop, regroup, and expose himself. This belief was not naive. It was built on experience. In earlier campaigns, crossings had required time. Time to assemble pontoons, time to secure banks, time to protect engineers working under fire. Rivers created pauses in war, and pauses could be exploited. That assumption shaped everything: defensive maps, artillery plans, reserve positioning. When the bridges over the Rhine were demolished, German commanders believed they had restored a familiar rhythm to the battlefield. They expected delay. They expected congestion. They expected the Allies to behave as armies always had. What they did not expect was for the crossing to stop being an operation at all. The DUKW had not been designed as a breakthrough weapon. It was never meant to replace bridges or defeat defenses. It existed for a quieter purpose: keeping supply moving when infrastructure failed. That distinction mattered. Traditional crossings were dramatic by necessity. They demanded coordination, protection, and visibility. The DUKW required none of that. It did not announce a crossing. It did not wait for permission. It simply moved. German doctrine relied on identifying decisive moments. The DUKW erased them. Instead of one large crossing site, there were dozens of small ones. Instead of a single timetable, there was constant motion. Instead of engineers clustered under fire, there were vehicles slipping in and out of the river along miles of shoreline. There was nothing obvious to destroy. German artillery crews waited for targets that never quite formed. Commanders searched for choke points that did not exist. Reports arrived describing crossings, but none of them seemed decisive enough to justify a response. Individually, each DUKW crossing looked insignificant. Collectively, they were catastrophic. The German system had been built to stop mass. It struggled to react to flow. Every vehicle that crossed carried something small, but together they sustained everything that followed. Fuel that kept engines running, ammunition that kept pressure constant, food that kept units from pausing. The result was not an immediate collapse. It was something more dangerous: continuity. German defenders found themselves facing Allied units that never seemed to exhaust themselves. There was no obvious moment of vulnerability, no lull to exploit, no pause where counterattacks could regain the initiative. The river had failed to produce friction. That failure exposed a deeper problem. German engineering culture prized optimization. Vehicles were built for specific conditions, tested to exact standards, and expected to perform within narrow limits. This produced impressive machines, but also brittle systems. The DUKW represented the opposite philosophy. It was not perfect on land. It was not perfect in water. But it worked well enough in both. And more importantly, it worked immediately. German planners had assumed that anything attempting to combine roles would fail at all of them. They were not wrong in theory. They were wrong about war. By 1945, war was no longer about ideal solutions. It was about keeping things moving faster than the enemy could react. The DUKW did not defeat German defenses directly. It made them irrelevant. The Rhine was still there. The water was still deep. The bridges were still gone. But none of those facts slowed the advance in any meaningful way. German commanders began to realize that the problem was not that the river had been crossed. It was that the crossing no longer mattered. What they had built their defense around, a predictable pause, had simply vanished. And once that realization took hold, another followed close behind. If a river could no longer buy time, then nothing behind it would either. The war on the Western Front was accelerating. And the German system, designed to control the tempo, was now chasing it. The DUKW did not emerge from a moment of genius. It came from discomfort. Early in the war, American planners had discovered a recurring problem that doctrine could not solve cleanly. Supplies arrived at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and often stopped completely when ports, roads, or bridges failed. Amphibious landings exposed the weakness brutally. Cargo piled up offshore. Vehicles waited uselessly on beaches. Engineers worked heroically, but the delay itself became the enemy. The response was not to design a perfect amphibious vehicle, but to accept an imperfect one that could exist immediately, in large numbers, and without special preparation. This decision ran against almost every instinct of traditional military engineering. Combining a truck with a boat meant accepting compromise everywhere. The hull would never be as seaworthy as a true landing craft. The drivetrain would never be as robust as a dedicated transport. Maintenance officers complained. Drivers distrusted it. Engineers warned that it violated basic principles of optimization. All of that was true. None of it mattered. American production philosophy during the war had quietly shifted away from ideal performance and toward systemic reliability. The question was no longer whether a machine could perform flawlessly under controlled conditions, but whether thousands of them could function acceptably under chaos. The DUKW fit that logic perfectly. It could be built quickly. It used existing components. It did not require elite crews or specialized training. Most importantly, it could be absorbed into logistics networks without demanding structural change. This mattered because the Allied advance across Western Europe was no longer about isolated battles. It was about sustaining motion across broken landscapes. Every kilometer forward increased strain on supply lines. Every destroyed bridge threatened to slow everything behind it. The DUKW turned those threats into inconveniences. If a river blocked a road, the road simply ended at the water and resumed on the far bank. No ceremony, no pause, no operational spotlight. German intelligence struggled to interpret what was happening because it did not resemble a crossing operation. There were no obvious preparations to detect, no massing of engineers, no critical window to disrupt. The movement was constant, low profile, and spread out. Reports described vehicles entering rivers at random points, but none of those reports suggested a decisive event. The German system, trained to respond to peaks, could not justify reacting to a steady baseline. As the Allies pushed deeper into Germany, this difference in philosophy became increasingly decisive. German countermeasures depended on time. Time to reposition units, time to repair damage, time to re-establish coherence after retreat. The DUKW quietly stole that time. Supplies arrived faster than German planners believed possible. Units stayed active longer than expected. Attacks followed one another without the traditional pauses that doctrine assumed were inevitable. What made this especially dangerous was that it did not feel like a failure at first. There was no dramatic collapse to trigger alarm. The river defenses had worked as designed. Bridges were gone. The Rhine remained intact as a physical obstacle. On paper, the system was still functioning. In practice, it had been bypassed by something it did not recognize as a threat. German engineering culture had always assumed that solutions must be elegant to be effective. The DUKW was neither. It was loud, awkward, and visibly compromised. That visual imperfection reinforced the belief that it could not matter strategically. But war does not reward elegance. It rewards continuity. The DUKW ensured that nothing stopped moving simply because infrastructure failed. By the time German commanders began to understand this, the implications were already spreading beyond the river. If supplies could cross without bridges, then defensive depth lost meaning. Lines drawn on maps no longer corresponded to delays on the ground. The Rhine had been treated as a final natural barrier. What the DUKW revealed was that barriers only mattered if both sides agreed to respect them. The American system did not. It treated terrain as a variable, not a rule. That flexibility, embedded in logistics rather than tactics, began to reshape the tempo of the entire front. German units were not being outmaneuvered in the traditional sense. They were being outpaced by a flow they could not interrupt. And once pace was lost, control followed. The DUKW did not win battles. It ensured that battles kept happening without pause. In a war already slipping out of German hands, that difference was fatal. The first signs that something was wrong did not appear at the river. They appeared behind it. German units expected the familiar rhythm of delay that followed major obstacles. After a river crossing, there was usually a lull. Hours or days when attackers reorganized, repaired vehicles, and rebuilt supply lines. Defenders used that pause to reposition artillery, move reserves, and restore a sense of structure. Along the Rhine, that pause never came. Allied pressure continued without interruption. Fuel arrived. Ammunition followed. Medical evacuation functioned. Units rotated forward and back with a smoothness that made no sense given the terrain. Reports from the front began to contradict planning assumptions. German commanders were not losing ground dramatically. They were losing the ability to predict when pressure would ease. It never did. This erosion of predictability mattered more than any single engagement. German defensive doctrine depended on identifying moments of weakness created by logistics. When attackers slowed, defenders counterattacked. When supply lines stretched thin, resistance stiffened. The DUKW erased those cues. The front no longer breathed. It pressed forward continuously, leaving no natural seams to exploit. Attempts to respond revealed the depth of the problem. Artillery was repositioned to interdict likely crossing points, only to find that crossings were occurring everywhere and nowhere at once. Air reconnaissance struggled to identify decisive targets because there were none. Destroying a handful of vehicles changed nothing. The flow continued. It was not concentrated enough to crush and too widespread to contain. German reserves, already thin, were committed piecemeal in an effort to regain control. Each commitment assumed that a delay would follow, creating space to reorganize. Instead, Allied units arrived faster than expected, supported by supplies that seemed to appear on demand. Counterattacks ran into prepared positions that should not have existed yet. The timetable had slipped, and with it, confidence in the system. This was not a failure of courage or competence at the unit level. German soldiers fought, withdrew, and regrouped as ordered. What failed was the framework that connected those actions into a coherent defense. Orders were issued based on assumptions about time that no longer held. By the time adjustments reached the front, the situation had already changed. The DUKW's contribution to this collapse remained largely invisible. It did not feature in dramatic after-action reports. It did not appear in photographs of decisive moments. Its work happened between events, in the quiet spaces where logistics either failed or succeeded. Because it succeeded quietly, the failure on the German side appeared abstract and confusing. Commanders began to notice that every fallback position seemed to be engaged sooner than expected. Defensive lines were formed, only to find the enemy already supplied and probing. There was no sense of catching up. Each delay assumed by planning documents had vanished, replaced by a continuous forward motion that planning tools could not model. This created a psychological effect as well as a practical one. When time stops behaving as expected, trust in doctrine erodes. Officers hesitated, unsure whether delaying actions would buy anything at all. Requests for reinforcements multiplied, not because positions were collapsing instantly, but because no one could see where stability would return. The front felt permanently unsettled. German engineering solutions, once a source of confidence, now highlighted the contrast. Bridges destroyed with care had accomplished their task physically, yet failed strategically. Fortifications delayed advances locally, but did not alter the overall pace. Each solution worked in isolation, while the system around it failed to slow the enemy. The realization was unsettling. Effort was no longer translating into time. The Allies did not need to announce a breakthrough. They were already beyond the point where German planners expected them to be. The Rhine, once a line of defense, had become a detail in a larger movement that refused to pause. The DUKW had not created this movement alone, but it ensured that nothing essential interrupted it. By the time German command acknowledged that the river had not bought the expected delay, the damage was done. The defense was no longer reacting to events. It was reacting to their consequences. Decisions arrived late, resources followed too slowly, and plans were revised after they were already obsolete. The war in the West was not ending because a single barrier failed. It was ending because the concept of barriers itself had lost meaning. And once that happened, the outcome became a matter of exhaustion rather than tactics. By the final weeks of the campaign, German commanders no longer spoke about the Rhine as a failed obstacle. They spoke about tempo. Something fundamental had shifted, and it was not something they could repair with orders or engineering units. The Allied advance no longer depended on specific conditions being met. It did not wait for bridges, ports, or perfectly prepared routes. It moved when movement was possible, and it kept moving when conditions deteriorated. This was the point at which the DUKW ceased to be merely a vehicle and became a symbol of a deeper imbalance. German planners could still identify weaknesses in Allied equipment. They could still point out inefficiencies, waste, and crude solutions. None of those critiques changed the reality unfolding on the ground. The Allied system absorbed imperfections without slowing. The German system magnified them. Every German attempt to restore control relied on the same assumption. That effort could buy time. More demolitions, more defensive lines, more carefully planned withdrawals. Yet each measure produced less delay than expected. Units fell back according to schedule, only to find that Allied forces arrived sooner than predicted, already supplied, already coordinated. The space between decisions and consequences had collapsed. This collapse exposed a limit the German war effort could not cross. Their system required stability to function. Precision engineering required maintenance windows. Command structures required predictable delays to synchronize action. Once those delays disappeared, the system lost coherence. Decisions piled up faster than they could be processed. Local commanders acted correctly, but without effect at the operational level. The DUKW did not cause this failure by itself. It revealed it. It made visible the difference between an army designed to optimize and an army designed to persist. The Allies did not always choose the best solution. They chose the solution that kept the system intact under pressure. That choice compounded over time, quietly, relentlessly. German leadership began to understand that no technical fix could reverse this trend. Building better bridges would not matter if the enemy no longer needed them. Improving defensive engineering would not help if pressure never paused long enough to exploit it. The war had shifted from one of decisive obstacles to one of continuous strain, and Germany was already operating at its limits. Morale suffered accordingly, not because defeats were sudden, but because they were constant. There was no moment of relief, no sense that a line held long enough to matter. Soldiers noticed that the enemy always seemed ready, always supplied, always present. The impression was not of overwhelming force, but of inevitability. Resistance delayed outcomes, but it no longer shaped them. This realization spread upward. Reports grew more cautious, plans grew shorter in scope. Expectations narrowed from victory to delay, then from delay to survival. The DUKW never appeared in these discussions by name. It did not need to. Its effect was already embedded in the reality everyone was responding to. By the time German commanders accepted that the problem was systemic rather than situational, there was nothing left to adapt. Changing doctrine required time. Rebuilding logistics required space. Neither existed anymore. The Allies had not broken the German defense in a single strike. They had removed its ability to recover between strikes. The Rhine had been the last place where German planners expected to regain control of time. When that control failed to materialize, the remaining weeks of the war became a matter of endurance rather than strategy. And endurance favored the side whose systems did not depend on perfection to keep moving. When the fighting ended, no official report singled out the DUKW as a decisive weapon. There were no victory parades built around it, no iconic photographs marking a moment when it won the war. In the records, it appeared quietly, usually in logistical notes or technical appendices. That absence was revealing. Wars remember explosions. They forget flow. By the spring of 1945, the Western Front did not collapse because German units stopped fighting. It collapsed because the system that held them together lost its ability to recover. Every withdrawal assumed a pause that never arrived. Every new defensive line assumed time to settle that no longer existed. The Allies did not overwhelm Germany with a single breakthrough. They exhausted it by refusing to stop. The Rhine had once been imagined as a final lever of control. It failed not because it was crossed, but because it stopped shaping events. It no longer imposed delay. It no longer forced decisions. The DUKW was only one part of that change, but it embodied the philosophy behind it. Keep moving, accept imperfection, and never let infrastructure failure dictate tempo. German planners had trusted mastery over obstacles. If barriers were strong enough, time would follow. The Allies approached the problem differently. They treated time as the primary objective and obstacles as variables to be worked around, not solved perfectly. That difference rarely looked dramatic in any single moment, but it compounded relentlessly. After the war, this lesson spread quietly. Standardization expanded. Logistics gained status. Flexibility replaced elegance as a virtue. The DUKW itself faded, but the idea it represented did not. Modern conflict, and modern organizations more broadly, came to favor systems that function under disruption rather than systems that demand ideal conditions. Nothing about the DUKW was revolutionary on its own. It did not introduce a breakthrough technology. It did not outperform specialized machines in their best environments. It simply refused to stop when conditions were wrong. In doing so, it exposed a weakness far larger than any destroyed bridge. Germany did not lose for lack of intelligence, bravery, or technical skill. It lost because its systems required stability in a world that no longer provided it. Once that mismatch became clear, the outcome was no longer a question of tactics. It was a question of endurance. And endurance belonged to the side that did not need perfection to keep going. The lesson here is not about a vehicle. It is about systems. The German approach was not foolish. Precision, optimization, and excellence are powerful strengths. The failure came from building an entire system on the assumption that the world would provide enough time and ideal conditions for perfection to operate. When reality violated that assumption, the system could not adjust. The Allied approach accepted a harsher truth. Environments are chaotic, plans break, and infrastructure fails at the worst possible moment. Instead of trying to control every variable, they designed systems that tolerated deviation. Not the best solution, not the most elegant one, just the one that would keep moving. This applies directly to modern life. Many people delay action while waiting for perfect conditions. Enough money, enough time, enough confidence, enough certainty. But the world rarely delivers everything at once. If your personal system only works when conditions are ideal, it will stall the moment pressure appears. People who go farther are not always more talented at the start. They have one advantage. They do not stop when things are imperfect. They build habits, workflows, and routines that keep functioning despite flaws. Like the DUKW, they are not impressive on paper. They are effective in motion. The real question is not, is this the perfect solution? It is, will this let me keep going? Which matters more in your life and work? A. Waiting for a perfect solution before acting. Accepting an imperfect solution that keeps you moving forward. Please comment A or B below and share your perspective so others can learn from it as well. And if you value World War II stories told through systems, consequences, and lessons that still matter today, consider subscribing to WW2 Forgotten Fronts. Your support helps the channel keep producing thoughtful, high-quality stories like this one.